So for people that don't know, you started the coaches site. And first I want to know how that came to be, because I want to get into that exact question of you. So for example, I listened to Matt Dumichel talk about all these different club systems from around the world and all these things. So one, I want to know first how you got into it, because then I want to lead into what you're seeing now from that exact perspective on how coaching is different in different places. So start with how you got into it first, like how the coaches site came to be like an idea and a thing you wanted to do, and then I'll branch it into that.
Yeah, I'll try and keep it.
You don't have to. You can ramble on.
Yeah, well, so I had coached in the BCHL and Junior B in BC for a number of years. So in my 20s, like I was moving, I think the longest I lived anywhere was 2 years. And if you had to ask me at that time, I would have said my goal was to be an NHL coach. Two of the most pivotal times in my life, when I was 18, I realized I wasn't going to be a pro hockey player, and that was a kick in the shins. And then when I was 30 years old, I realized I wasn't going to be a professional coach. That was also a kick in the shins. But I in 2008, I'd been in Penticton in the BCHL. We won a championship, got hired as an assistant coach with UBC, and moved down there. And I couldn't even tell you today like how I got this opportunity, but I became a coach mentor for Vancouver minor hockey. So that included like going out to practices, and I would do these seminars, like a handful throughout the year. And, I think what's unique about coaching everywhere is predominantly you get people that are super passionate, they're super committed, and they have the best intentions. And that was certainly the case with the coaches I was working with there. But what struck me was that they were doing the same things that my coaches did with me when I was growing up, and it became really apparent that there was sort of this vacuum of information, whereas like in junior hockey, college hockey, pro hockey, coaches talked all the time, they shared ideas, but it seemed like in minor hockey everybody kept their cards close to their chest. So I mentioned when I was 30, I realized I did 2 years at UBC. I kind of stepped back and said, okay, like what's the trajectory for me if I want to like actually like have a career and earn a living that's going to allow me, to have a family and do things like that. And I was like, this doesn't seem like the thing to put all my chips on the table for. So I had to figure out what to do. And while I did that, I figured I would start a coaching conference in Vancouver, not as a business. It was solely for me. It was a way for me to stay involved with the game. It would be a chance for me in the summer to have some buddies come back, hang out with them. They could, present. And I thought it would really add value just to our local minor hockey scene, because there wasn't really anything. I think at the time, Roger Nielsen was run here out of Windsor.
Yeah, I remember him, yeah.
But obviously that was a big hike. So it was just something, in that part of the world to help coaches. And, I would also preface this by saying like, I wasn't qualified to organize a 10-year-old's birthday party at the time. Like I had to go to like the hotel, rent the rooms, like had no clue what I was doing. But we did it our first year. We had 98 coaches show up. And gosh, I'm trying to think who we had that year. We had our first ever presenter was Ryan Huska, the Calgary Flames. He was with the Kelowna Rockets at the time. Ray Ferraro spoke that year.
So you had like some good, like, because that was gonna be my next question. Like you had some actual like relatively well-known speakers right off the hop.
Yeah, but at the time, like Ryan wasn't a big name speaker.
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? We had, who else? We had Kevin Constantine, who was with Everett at the time, and that's probably been like, listen, I mean, there's been so many cool aspects of this journey, but one of them has absolutely been like, the opportunity to work with a lot of these coaches on their way up, because you appreciate the commitment, the grind, like just the sacrifices their families make, all of that. So when you see Ryan Huska become a head coach in the NHL, like, man, you're so pumped for him, But anyway, so second year, we had 200 coaches show up. I think that year we had like Hitchcock, Mike Keenan, and people started flying in. At this point, it was like all word of mouth. So
and what year would this have been?
The first year was 2011. And I think it was in 2012, like just, again, this was very much a hobby. And somebody's like, hey, you should start a blog. I'm like, what's a blog? And they're like, oh, it's like you just like put content up and stuff so people can find you. So I started like a blog, and somebody's like, you should get on Twitter. And so like I got on Twitter. Again, not really knowing what we're doing, but like I'll also note too, like that first year, I lost $16,000 on the conference at a time when like I had no money.
Yeah.
So I had to get up at 5 a.m. to go to the Richmond Ice Center to do lessons. I did decamps. I did that, I think 6 days a week for a whole season to pay that off. And I can remember my mom and stuff, like, she's like, why would you possibly think about doing this again? And I'm like, I really like this. And I think it's like, this is going to be my way to stay involved in hockey. But yeah, anyways, fast forward, we do the blog. And then kind of one of the pivotal moments was I got a call out of the blue from a guy named Ken McDonald, who at the time was the chief growth officer for Team Snap. And he called me up and he's like, hey, we've had the most conversions in Canada off your blog through Google AdWords. And I was like, what's Google AdWords? And he's like, just kind of pauses and he's like, okay. He's like, listen, we saw that you do a conference. Do you have sponsorship for the conference? And we didn't. And I was like, yes. And he's like, how much is that? And I would just like pause. I'm like, $1,200. Yeah. And he's like, that's it? And I'm like, man. And I'm like, yeah. And he's like, we'll see you at the conference. So Team Snap, I think it was with 2 years later, they bought the naming rights to the conference. So for a while, it was the Team Snap Hockey Coaches Conference. But what became really evident at that point is there was this sort of influx of sports technologies, generally that were starting at the higher levels, and they wanted a way to kind of, connect with people at the grassroots level and just recognize that there was going to be a bit of a shift where, sports was changing, youth sports was changing, and whether it was, looking for efficiencies for volunteers or ways to enhance player development, that this was going to be a thing, and that there was going to need to be a market for these startups or organizations to kind of showcase what they were up to.
That's sweet, man. So at what point did it turn into? Because I'm assuming you don't have a tech background, so.
No.
Yeah. So when you turn, now we're talking about turning this into like a platform.
Eric, I feel like I'm at NASA right now with your setup. Yeah.
That's what Andy, my partner, would say too, man. He doesn't know one thing about this stuff. But so it went from you're on a blog just throwing up whatever you're thinking about writing or that you can find, and now you want to turn this more into like an actual platform. So that's like a pretty big jump from like I'm running a conference to I'm going to turn this into like a distribution platform for content online, right?
Yeah. So it's a funny story. Like my wife's in marketing, and she works with Lululemon now, but at the time, she worked for this company called Dilawri. So it's like an automotive dealership across Western Canada. And she did all the media buying. And she spent a lot of money with Rogers Media. So she got invited to this retreat in Cancun, Mexico. And she was allowed to bring a +1. Fortunately, I'm the +1. And we go down there. And there's another guy on the trip named Di Manuel. And Di was the COO at the time of Fitness Town. But he also had the #1 fitness blog in Canada. So we're literally just like hanging out by the pool, small talk. What do you do? And, at the time I was, doing a lot of hockey development. I was going back and forth to China. The coach's site was kind of just, again, it was a hobby. But he started he took an interest in it. And he said, do you videotape the presentations? And we did. And he's like, well, what do you do with them? And I'm like, I don't know. Like, it just, like, we do it because it feels like the right thing to do, but they're like literally just sitting on a hard drive somewhere. And he's like, you should start a membership site. And I'm like, what's that? He's like, have you heard of Netflix? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, it's like Netflix. You could be Netflix for hockey. And he kind of like literally like on the poolside, probably on a cocktail napkin, like sketched this whole thing out. So I go back to Vancouver and I get connected with this guy who can build a website. Like we would have been using like a WordPress blog at the time. And so we go get all these videos, we get them edited, might even be a stretch, but we turn them into like, something we can put online. We build a site. And again, like this is a hobby. So I wasn't really hands-on. Finally, the site's ready. I look at it and I'm like, this is terrible. Like it just wasn't a good user experience. The branding was off. Like nothing about it looked professional. And but it had the coach's site URL. And again, not being, a technologist, I just thought like, well, we're not going to talk about it, so nobody's going to find it. So the guy that built it, I said, look, like we gotta, circle the wagons. We're gonna start from scratch again and do something that, I'd kind of be proud to show my pals. And a couple weeks go by and he calls me and he's like, hey, Aaron, he's like, I know you don't like the website, but we've had signups. And I'm like, what are you talking about? He's like, we've had almost 100 people sign up. Like, visit the site. He's like, no, like they paid money, like they put their credit card down and they're signing up to watch the videos. I'm like, you're kidding me. Like, we hadn't done anything. So at that point, like, that's where I was like, I'm like, hey, like, how, let's speed this up. Like, how quickly can we get a site out there? So we eventually we redo it. We get our site. And at the time it was sort of a combination of like, there was some articles and yeah, and we just started growing a bit of a following, and it was crazy. All of a sudden we got on, Google Analytics and started tuning into that. And we're like, holy cow, like people are coming in from like all over the world to see this content. And it was, it was, again, for something that, again, there was zero intention for it to become that. It was, that was a pretty cool moment in
Yeah.
time.